how to communicate your way to greater connection in your marriage. That's our topic today, and I'm excited to share with you a little bit about these communication strategies to help your relationship gain in strength and in wellness and in closeness and in fulfillment. So stay tuned. Okay, so communicating in order to grow your connection in your relationship. This topic is so important for couples that we work with. Communication is one of the number one reasons that couples come to couples counseling. And as we work with couples in our counseling office, as we do coaching, relational coaching with couples, this communication dynamic is a really important one. And one of the things that many couples don't understand is how to communicate in such a way that builds connection and fosters closeness and increases the wellness of the relationship with the couple. We call this, in general, emotional intimacy and communicating in a way that builds emotional intimacy in relationships. Emotional intimacy is just any type of emotional closeness or connection, attachment, fulfillment that is built in the relationship. And a lot of that connection can be done in your communication style. Learning how to communicate in a way that fosters emotional connection and enhances and increases the level of fulfillment that you feel with one another. So that's going to be our topic today, how to communicate in such a way that you can increase that connection in your marriage. And I'm excited to kind of jump into these communication styles. Today I'm going to present to you 3 different communication styles that couples commonly use. And only one of those communication styles really does a lot to enhance connection. So let's begin then by taking a look at these 3 communication styles. The first is a critical and defensive style. The second is an analytical style. And the third is a connective style, and that's the one that we want to talk most about today. But let me explain all 3 because you're probably quite familiar with these 3 communication styles, and you may find yourself utilizing one or more of these in your relationship. So a critical and defensive communication style, the focus of that style of communication is to criticize your partner's stance and to defend your own stance. So when couples use this type of communication style, they're typically trying to defend where they are and the opinions and the needs and the desires they have in a relationship, and to criticize, put down, or discard those of their spouse. And that's kind of the focus of this style. I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute, but you can tell already it's not the best style for building relational connection in your marriage. The second style that's very common for couples is an analytical style. The analytical style's focus is on solving problems. So this style of communication is very common in a workplace environment, in a community kind of committee that you might be serving on. The focus of this communication is just on assessing what the issues are and how can we fix or solve those problems. The third communication style is this connective communication style. And the focus of a connection communication style is to foster connection in the relationship, right? So this type of communication is specifically designed to enhance the connection that a couple feels in their relationship. This is the one that we want to do more of, and this is the one that most couples don't do well. So I'm going to share with you a little bit more about that in a minute, but let's start again with the critical and defensive, and let's talk a little bit about the goals of each of these communication styles so that you can kind of see where they end up fitting in a relationship, and so that you can kind of reassess how you use communication in your relationship. So jumping back then to the critical and defensive style of communication, the goal of this style of communication is to criticize your partner's stance and to defend your own stance. So you're going to find in this type of communication style things like an effort to disprove my partner's views, to defend my side of a conflict, to identify hypocrisies in my partner and to point those out to my partner, to hold my partner accountable, to get my way, right? That's kind of the goals of this communication style. And it's very focused, it's kind of me-centered in the relationship. It's very focused on my needs, my wants, my preferences, my desires, my thoughts, my feelings, right? Like it's very focused on me. And it makes very little room for my partner. In fact, it sees my partner as threatening to me. It treats my partner as if they're an adversary to me, right? And it focuses on how can I get them to see my side versus really trying to understand and see their side. So it's a communication style that's not really great for relationships, and yet most couples who are having conflict utilize this style of communication. It's the least effective in helping build connection and relationship. In fact, you'll see at the bottom of this image that I'm sharing with you that there's the lowest level of intimacy potential in this type of communication. If we're moving left to right and we're saying the critical and defensive style is the lowest potential for intimacy building because it requires the least amount of vulnerability. And because it requires the least amount of vulnerability, and there's a one-to-one correlation between intimacy potential and vulnerability, this style is probably going to actually hurt your intimacy much more than it's ever going to help your intimacy. So we want to be really careful about the critical and defensive style. In fact, I would say that couples should work to eliminate this style of communication in their relationship with one another. And I'll share with you more about that in just a minute. But let's jump into the analytical communication style. And you'll see at the bottom of this image that it's a little bit more neutral. It's kind of halfway between low and high intimacy potential, and it's kind of neutral in the vulnerability style as well. The goals of the analytical, as I mentioned earlier, are to really help solve problems in a relationship. And so there's definitely times in your relationship that you'll use the analytical style, right? So common kind of bullet points for analytical style is that it's working to identify problems, that it's trying to solve or fix problems, it's trying to discourage the continuance of a problem in a relationship, and it wants to reinforce best solutions in a relationship. So this can be a really handy communication style, right? And as I mentioned earlier, it's a communication style that's often used in many settings and in many relationships where there's a dynamic that's trying to diagnose and kind of solve a problem. So it's not a problematic communication style per se. We just want to keep in mind that when you're using this style of communication, you're not really doing a lot to build intimacy or to tear down intimacy in your relationship. The emotional intimacy for analytical style communication is kind of neutral. It doesn't really build up emotional intimacy. It doesn't really tear it down. But it is effective in solving problems. And couples need to solve problems in their relationship, whether it's parental problems, if it's career problems, if it's in-law problems, right? If it's financial decisions that we're trying to make. We face a lot of dynamics where we need to be able to solve problems. And this can be a great communication style for solving or fixing problems in a relationship. Okay, so the third style of communication then that I shared with you earlier is the connective communication. And the goals of the connective are a little different than the other two. Things like increasing understanding or strengthening empathy in your relationship, creating validation and support, right? Trying to build those things in the relationship, communicating love and interest, or to encourage confidence, right? You can see by these bullet points that the connective communication is really focused on how do we bridge a connection between both partners? How do we bring them closer together with deeper understanding, right? With an awareness of one another, focusing on nurturing and supporting and strengthening one another. These are the focuses and the goals of connective communication style. And its high-level intimacy potential, right? When you look at it on the spectrum of communication, this is the communication style that has the greatest potential for fostering and building emotional intimacy in your relationship. It's the reason we want to turn to this one the most, right? And most couples really struggle to know how to use connective communication style. So that's the reason that we're talking about it today. So let's take this one step further then. Let's take a look at common phrases, right? If you were going to be familiar with these type of communication strategies, what do they sound like, right? What are common phrases in a relationship that you might hear if somebody is using one of these communication styles? So back to the critical and defensive communication style. Here's some common phrases. Are you kidding me? You're the one that, right? Like blaming my partner. Don't blame me. I only do this because you do that, right? So it's focused on hypocrisies. No, that's it. I'm not doing this anymore. Oh, really? You think so, huh? Right? Like, so sarcastic, defensive styles. Good luck with that, right? So these are really common phrases that you might hear, and you might even find yourself using in your relationship, right? These are phrases that couples commonly use when they're in conflict. And the greater the conflict, the more we tend to turn to critical and defensive communication. Now, as I shared earlier, this is a communication style that really tears down emotional intimacy. It does nothing to foster greater emotional intimacy, right? If we're going to talk about emotional intimacy as connection and attachment, understanding, right, fulfillment, nurturing in your relationship, this type of communication style really tears those things down. So we're trying to eliminate this type of communication in the relationship as much as possible. We really don't want it there at all. And if you find yourself communicating in these ways often, it makes complete sense why your relationship might feel like it's drifting further and further apart. You're using a communication style that really does nothing to help you understand each other better, to repair and build stronger connection. You're using a communication style that's actually driving your relationship further apart. So that's the reason we want to share this, right? If we jump into the analytical now, it sounds a little different than the critical and defensive. Here are some common phrases for the analytical. Things like, so what's the issue? Or I think you're looking at this wrong. Or that won't work, right? Or it sounds like the problem is, here's my ideas. Here's what needs to happen. Or don't do that anymore, right? Or yes, that's the best idea, right? So if you were listening to an HOA, let's say, right? Like a housing committee meeting in the neighborhood that you lived. These are some common phrases that a group of people who are working toward a solution would likely be saying, right? Their goal isn't really to tear down one another. At least we're hoping that's not so, right? Like they're trying to work in unison. And so they're much more focused on best solutions and problem solving a best solution than they are criticizing a person's ideas or defending their own ideas, tearing down. I guess I should caveat that with how healthy your HOA might be in your community, right? But typically, a committee that's working well together, you're going to hear these types of phrases a lot. And they don't really do anything to build connection, and they also don't really do anything to tear down connection. That's why they're kind of neutral on the spectrum between low and high intimacy potential. They don't do a lot to foster intimacy, but they don't really do a lot to tear down intimacy. But this is important for you to keep in mind, and I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but that's important for you to keep in mind that it's kind of neutral, because stereotypically, most men default to this type of communication. In their everyday interactions, they're much more focused on what are issues and how can we solve those issues, and communicating much more about and around those types of things than any other form of communication, right? So that just says that stereotypically, now this isn't every man, right? But stereotypically, many men, right, because they communicate in this way and they haven't really learned an emotional intimacy form of communication, they're not really contributing to high levels of emotional intimacy in the relationship often, right? Their default is kind of an intimacy neutral communication style. And if that's the case for you, if you're a man listening to this and you realize this in your relationship, you also might be a lady listening to this and you might just be more analytical in your style in general, right? We want to really pay attention to that and foster a connective style, right? That we don't always have to be in connective style, but we want to learn how to do it so that when possible, we can be building the emotional intimacy in the relationship while we communicate. So let's take a deeper look then at connective communication. Here's some common phrases that you would find in a connective style. So things like, the trouble I'm having is, or what is it like for you? Or I see, wow, that makes sense, right? Or that must be hard or difficult or sad for you, right? Or thank you for letting me and for listening to me and for telling me, right? I love you, we've got this, what I'm seeing or feeling is, and how can I help? Right? So this communication style is very focused on the partner. It's very focused on trying to listen to understand and to share for understanding with my partner. It's trying to build connection, right? It's trying to step into each other's shoes. It's trying to nurture and support and strengthen one another in a conflict. And you can commonly hear these phrases, couples who learn to do connective communication well, you'll hear these phrases not just when the relationship's going well, you're going to hear these phrases when they're in a conflict as well, right? It's a respectful conflict. It's a kind conflict, right? It's a conflict that they're going through to try to increase understanding. They're standing in different places, but they want to bridge that gap together, right? And they're communicating in a way that will help bring them closer to an understanding of one another's needs and desires and preferences, which is the best type of communication, especially when we're in conflict. But it's the hardest type of communication to do when you're in conflict, because most of us want to default to a critical and defensive stance. Now, the connective communication I found over the years, just stereotypically, this isn't every couple, but most women are better at this communication style than men. And in fact, most women long for this communication style in their relationship much more than men realize, right? So it's a high potential communication style, and you'll see it often with girlfriends, right? Women who are friends with one another, especially when one of them's in a tough spot, you'll hear this type of connective communication being exchanged pretty regularly and pretty readily, right? It's something that they're really good at typically, right? Not every person, I don't want to stereotype too much, but in general, you'll see this a little bit more frequently with women, right? And it's a very high intimacy potential type communication. And many ladies in relationships are desiring it from their partners, right? So we want to learn how to do it. Now, here's the thing that's interesting, right? Because this is a very common strategy for women, many ladies just assume that men are really good at it. And then they feel hurt or frustrated, annoyed, or even discarded when their spouse or their partner won't use this style, right? And it sends them into a critical and defensive communication style, right? So she's not receiving a lot of emotional intimacy, and over time, it hurts her in such a way she ends up defaulting over to critical and defensive. As I told you earlier, many men are defaulting into the analytical style, right? And because they're defaulting there, they're communicating with their spouse much more from an analytical standpoint than they are a connective standpoint, right? And because of that, it can often drive them into defensive when their partner gets critical, right? When their partner starts to criticize them for not wanting to be more connected or not speaking with them or communicating with them in a way that helps them feel close, the men tend to get defensive, the women tend to get critical, and then they'll trade places back and forth. He'll criticize, she'll defend, she'll criticize, he'll defend, right? And round and round and round we go. You can reference our feedback loops video if you want to remember a little bit about that, right? So this is very common that men will kind of default into this analytical style. Many women will default into this connective style. And when they're missing each other in the communication, they'll both go to critical and defensive. And they can stay there if they're not careful, right? So the goal then is for us to learn a little bit more of the connective style. If you're listening to this and finding yourself not using that style often, practice that connective style, right? And let's enhance and enrich that in your relationship. Now, if you'd like to learn more about this topic, I have a whole video course that focuses on emotional intimacy and utilizing communication and other strategies to enhance emotional intimacy. It's the part 1 of our Maintaining Intimacy in Sex video module. And I go into great detail about this principle and several other principles that enhance for couples their ability to bridge connection in their relationship, and strategies that you can use to both assess how frequently you use this type of communication style, as well as practice strategies for implementing this style more. And any relationship could benefit from this connective style. Sometimes he's really good at it, sometimes she's really good at it, sometimes they're both really good at it, and sometimes neither one of them are good at it, right? So we want to help you get better at this connective style because it's the key to unlocking greater connection in your relationship. Also, if you're loving this topic, take a look at our whole module video course. That's a video course that I put together as well that talks a lot about conflict resolution, repair strategies, and types of things to avoid in your conflicts that really tear down emotional intimacy and create injury, and ways that you can repair from those places if you found yourself in some pretty tough communication styles and some pretty tough dynamics in your marriage. So take a look at that video course as well. As always, it's great to be with you. I'm grateful to spend the time with you, to share with you a little bit how you can enhance the connection in your relationship through communication. If you know anybody who could benefit from this, please share it. Otherwise, please like this video and follow us. Help us build our community to strengthen couples everywhere. We look forward to being with you again soon. Take care.